Coming up next is a keynote speaker, and he thoroughly expects some probing questions. He's got loads to offer you, loads of experience, loads of ideas, and he's going to be up here in just a little while. His name is Ed Gillespie. He is British. He's known as a futurist. He's an environmental entrepreneur. And he's the author of The Only Planet, Around the World Without Flying. So apparently he went around the world, literally, without getting on a plane. So that will be interesting to find out about, won't it? He's the co-founder of a change agency, and it specializes in business transformation and creative campaigns. Another thing that I'm sure that we can all learn some important points about. His name is Ed Gillespie, if you haven't guessed by now. He'll be with us in just a moment or two up here on the stage to give us his keynote address, after which I expect that you'll have a few questions, some probing questions, please, of Ed, because, as I say, he's expecting them. It's all part of the job. So can we welcome up now to the stage our keynote speaker today, Ed Gillespie. A big hand for him.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to take you on a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'm going to try and talk about climate, technology, and the future of work in 20 minutes. So this is going to be a fairly rapid roller coaster ride. You may well be aware that there has been another conference going on the other side of Europe in Glasgow, COP26, which has been trying to reconcile and wrangle with the intractable carbon emissions which are currently driving climate change. Unfortunately, in that sense, it's a bit like the Squid Game, in the fact that for the next game, keep messing with the climate and the survivors win, which is pretty much where we are at the moment in terms of the transformative capacity of what we need to try and deliver. And in some ways, this can feel like the apocalypse. And I don't mean that in terms of the Armageddon end of the world, but actually in the true etymology of the word, the revealing, the drawing back of the veil to see the world as it actually works. And that's interesting because what it actually reveals to us is this is kind of like a moment in time for humanity, where we are being forced to stir up our own fundament and try and do things radically differently. This is a moment in time when we have to shift. And my job as a futurist is not to predict and analyze existing trends. You know, it's about stretching the imagination of the possible. And in doing that, what we have to address is hearing the real questions that the future is asking of us. Because as the Buddhists say, the wise learn from the past, but the brave learn from the future. And when it comes to climate change, it's felt like we've had years of denial and disavowal and delay, which has taken us to a point where it really is us, and it really is very, very late in the day to be trying to address this. And any kind of cognizance of where the trends will be going is revealed by this particular graph. So you can see we are very much in the blue band at the moment. We're still, even after COP26 in Glasgow, delivering a world of somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees of climate change. And if we want to bring it down to the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees, it's the green line. It's a very, very steep and very, very rapid decarbonisation indeed. And climate change is different to other challenges. It is not like the ozone layer, which was happening in one place, caused by one thing, CFCs, and then therefore easily challengeable and solvable by the rest of the world. It's not like a war, because it's driven by us and our lifestyles. So if it's a war, we're all on multiple sides simultaneously. It's not an asteroid, because it's not an accident that has happened. There are vested interests involved. And it's not a problem to be solved. It is actually an era and a predicament which we tend to put off in 4 dimensions. We say it's not here, it's not now, it's not me, it's not clear. And we have to invert all of those assumptions. Because climate is just one of the waves which has been breaking over us. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic wave, which we're hopefully increasingly in the tail end of. We've had the recessionary wave of the economic disruption that came off the back of that. The climate change wave is coming, as is the ecological crisis, because this is not just about carbon. And perhaps the most comprehensive review we have of the economics of biodiversity, how much that ecology matters to our global economy, then the Dasgupta review showed us that there are some very significant risks, not just the physical ones that come from the flooding and the fires and the storm damage, but also the transition risks which come from the impacts on market capitalization of exposed businesses, and increasingly the litigation risks that come from knee-jerk regulation and other types of lawsuits. Because what we're doing, if you've seen the Hollywood movie The Big Short, which is all about the financial crisis of 2008, you will know from that movie that when they were trading all of those packages of toxic debt, the collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps, what brought the whole thing crashing down was inadequate financial capital underpinning all of that activity. And what we've essentially done is built an economy which is not underpinned by the necessary natural capital, all of the ecosystem services and processes which keep the whole show on the road. So we're engaged in a big short of ecology, of the very life support systems. And as Professor Johan Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Centre says, this is the planet starting to send back invoices to the economy. And I love this cartoon by Tom Toro in The New Yorker, where the ragged-trousered businessman is explaining to the kids in front of a dystopian city, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Now, we laugh awkwardly because we kind of know that that's true. And so that's what we have to do something about. Because a lot of people say, oh, that's very well, Ed. What about India? What about China? We always hear about different countries that are higher and up us on the kind of emissions table of global carbon. But this is not just about population. It's about consumption. And it's about how much we consume. 50% of global carbon emissions from lifestyle come from 10% of the global population. That's us in this room. And as they say in Fight Club, it's a bit like saying we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like who largely don't care. And that is the merry-go-round of materialism. And so to get through this, what we have to overcome is the willful blindness. And the willful blindness is actually a legal principle where you can be taken in court if you are responsible for something you could have known or should have known, or indeed something which you chose actively not to see. And climate has been one of these willfully blind issues. As my colleague at the Forward Institute, Margaret Heffernan, says, the truth won't set us free until we develop the skills, the habit, the talent, but perhaps most of all, the moral courage to use it. And if you want a great example of this sort of willful blindness, in terms of the amount of money still being invested in fossil fuels, which, by the way, we are still burning more fossil fuels than ever before in history right now, despite all of our successes in renewable energy, because that renewable energy is just additional to the base load of fossil fuels. It hasn't displaced any fossil fuels from the energy mix. And yet, if we look at what a net zero transition looks like, most of those are stranded assets. They are unburnable carbon and could be worthless in a little over 10 years as we start to embark on this. This is the willful blindness that exists in the economic system. And worse, those big oil and gas giants knew exactly what was going on and have known for decades. A friend of mine was interviewing the CEO of Shell, Ben van Beurden, and he put a call out on social media. He said, what shall I ask him? And I said, didn't you see this coming? Because they don't want to cope with the kind of turmoil and disruption that is clearly on the cards. They prefer to try and pretend it will just go away. And in the same way that these oil and gas giants have known about the climate crisis, in many ways, our big tech and data giants know exactly the same damage that they are doing, not just in terms of the data, but to our democracies and to our social systems. And so we need to look at these things with open eyes if we are to overcome them and get through this mess. I mean, everyone is talking about the metaverse now since Mark Zuckerberg's announcement last week, but the metaverse will be a reflection of us. It will just be, if we're not careful, another way to sell us things, another way to spread disinformation, and another way to immerse yourselves in the worst and darkest aspects of human nature. Because none of this comes without impact. You know, we're all here talking about data. Now, 90% of the world's data has been collected in just the last 2 years. Now, that's huge, and the server farms which are driving and storing that data could be 25% of global electricity demand by the middle of this decade. It is an exponential growth, and barely a fifth of that energy right now comes from renewable sources. So at the same time as we're trying to bring down energy demand and decarbonize our energy system, we are exponentially growing our energy appetite for data. And this is going to lead to some really bumpy times, because basically, evolutionary biologists talk about change in 2 ways. One is that it's phyletic gradualism, that change happens in these nice, long, smooth, gentle, graceful transitions that we can accommodate and that we can manage our way around. But actual fact, if you look at the evolutionary fossil record, what happens is what they call punctuated equilibria. Long periods of stability and then very rapid nonlinear change. And that is what we are going to get. Disruptive, painful, nonlinear change is coming. Which is why even people like the World Economic Forum during the pandemic talked about this opportunity as the Great Reset, of actually rethinking, not quite going back to first principles, but certainly re-examining in that apocalyptic drawing back of the veil, the way the world is actually working and who it is serving. And the Great Reset for them involved 3 different areas. One, fairness, basically trying to have a much better sense of justice coming through the system. I know which is a theme here in terms of equality of access. The right investment, so actually putting our money into the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals and those collaborations across business, public sector, and third sector organizations, but also the innovation that drives that 4th industrial revolution to decarbonize into clean energy. Because otherwise, we look at the world we might be trying to build back better is a bit like Darth Vader describing the construction of a new Death Star as an amazing job creation opportunity. I mean, it might well be, but unfortunately, at the same time, it also destroys planets. So we need to think about this as a transition in which sustainability, which is the buzzword of our times, is just a stepping stone towards what has to be a regenerative economy and a regenerative system. Because sustaining what we're doing now is not enough. We have to build back that natural capital. We have to restore those ecosystem services in order to provide the long-term resilience that is absolutely fundamental. And in the light of the way that most of our businesses are functioning and our economy is functioning, it's perhaps not surprising that we start to ask ourselves difficult questions individually. Now, the Gallup State of the Global Workplace report cites the fact that 80% of employees are either not engaged or worse, actively disengaged at work. You know, and that disengagement is a symptom of the fact that they can't grasp the purpose of what they are doing. And that's a really sad indictment that most of our work, unfortunately, is essentially bribery. It's not reward. We are bribing people to do things that they are not very comfortable with. And we particularly see this in the sort of data world where we've got now a bifurcation of jobs. In the old days, you could join an organization and have a good chance, perhaps, of working your way up through the ranks to get to the top. Now, those days are gone when you have this bifurcation of low-skilled and high-skilled workers with the hollowing out of the middle class and the middle-income earners in between. You are limited to what you will earn as an Uber driver, and you have practically no chance whatsoever of becoming an Uber coder, which is probably earning a salary 5 or 6 or even more times more than you would behind the wheel. And that matters, because this is also going to lead to a massive volatility, which it already has coming out of the pandemic, of people quitting their jobs, of people realizing that the work they were doing wasn't meaningful, and that quit rate is now at an all-time high of 3%. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but when you start to factor that in and the costs of that recruitment, it becomes quite significant. So the average cost of recruitment is about 122% of that employee's salary. So when you have a turnover in your workforce, this becomes a huge consumer of your time and your resources. And that great resignation is a trend that began before the pandemic and is only intensifying now. And what's also happening, as we've talked about in terms of hybrid work, is that huge organizations are taking very, very different positions on the return to work. So Nationwide, which is the biggest building society in the world, in the UK, and they have told all of their 13,000 staff that they never have to come back to the office if they don't want to. So everyone can enjoy hybrid working or home working as much as they want. Now that genie is now out of the bottle. As the previous panel were discussing, that accelerated trend of the future of work has actually led to a complete change in expectations of mobility, of commuting, of the potential for commercial real estate, and indeed the value of that real estate, and all of the opportunities for a creative reinvention of the way cities work, which we are still, I think, failing to grasp. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Goldman Sachs, which has basically said, we want everyone back in the office tomorrow and working full-time all day, every day, which says something about the sort of boiler room mentality of investment banking. But between those two extreme positions, we have everyone else. And it's clear that if we are going to reap the benefits of rethinking and resetting on the back of the pandemic, we have to be able to facilitate organizations making the right decisions. Now, of course, it's nice to be back on a stage talking to a real-life audience. I've remembered how to dress from the waist down for the first time in about 18 months. And we've all had probably enough screen time. But the fact is, we need to be able to balance, as we are in these hybrid style of events, the magic and the kind of connection of bringing people together with the much greater reach of being able to do things online and the benefits that come back from quality of life. Because the factors which are going to shift the future of work in the context of both technology and climate are going to be the locations in which we work, which obviously, as I said, will be mainly hybrid, the time and the hours that we work. And again, my colleague Margaret Heffernan, who has been CEO of 5 different digital businesses, she said, I have never told a single employee when they should work, where they should work, or how they should work. She goes, I've always trusted them to do what needs to be done, and I have never been let down. Because, as I said, in terms of the dissatisfaction in the workplace, the other thing is social health. Our work should be our well-being. A well-being program should not be bolted on to the periphery of your business to help your staff cope with terrible hours and purposeless work. The actual thrust of our work should enhance their sense of well-being. So these place, time, and social health are really critical because we don't love a lot of our work. As Sarah Jaffa says in her book, work won't love you back. You know, there's actually not much reciprocity in this when we're paying people bribery, not reward. And so a lot of this requires us to reimagine our culture, to reimagine a very different way of working, the right use of technology, and the addressing of the climate and ecological crisis in an integrated way. Because unless we get that culture right, no matter what strategies we have, We will continue to replicate the mistakes of the past. And right now, our culture is a bit like a toddler with a machine gun, going at the world, unquestioning, in a slightly volatile, increasingly dangerous and unhinged type of way. And I spoke at an electric vehicle conference in Norway last week, and it's fascinating that even that type of technological shift, which in one sense feels brilliant to get rid of the dirty internal combustion engine and to have electric vehicles on the street, but it does not change the fact that those vehicles are incredibly inefficient and they are taking up the road space that things like the 15-minute city that Anne Hidalgo talks about in Paris and Carlos Moreno discuss, the fact that we will still be stuck in traffic, because as anyone who has ever said when they've been sat behind the wheel of a car in a traffic jam and complained about the traffic, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic, and we will still be sat in clean, quiet traffic jams. In that sense, technology is not an answer. It is a question which forces us to ask something different of what is coming. And I think the best example of beautiful technology that I've ever experienced is a collective called Marshmallow Laser Feast, who did an installation, a virtual reality installation, where you put on a backpack and the head visor, and you basically traveled inside a sequoia tree, a giant sequoia tree. And you could see the breath coming out of your mouth, you could see the oxygenated blood vessels in your arms, and you could see your inextricable interdependence and interconnection with all of those invisible cycles of life that are happening all around us all the time. The transpiration of water through the tree, the mixing of that with your breath and the water vapor in the air, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide being exchanged. As the great Greek philosopher Thales said, we live not in reality on the summit of a solid earth, but at the bottom of an ocean of air. And this experience, this virtual reality experience, was so emotional. People were moved to tears by the visualization of stuff which is happening all around us all the time. And it's incredibly powerful to think about how we can use our technologies in ways which touch our souls, which don't just titillate our minds. And the same collective have done other things like Through the Eyes of an Animal, which enabled you to see the perspective of the world through various different beasts. And they call this extended reality. It's not virtual reality. It's creating another layer of sensory perception to allow us to perceive the world as it actually is, with us as one indivisible part of a beautiful, complex system. And I think if we're going to wrangle with these challenges, we have to have a different type of thinking, a different type of embodied thinking. It's not just the head. It's not just the cold, logical, rational, numerical parts of our brains. It is also the compassion of our hearts and the instinct of our guts that tell us what is the right and proper thing to do. As my friend Tom Mansfield, founder of Pale Blue, says, he describes this as heart-led technology, which is technology which is in service of something deeper than the wants and mores of the mind and all of that dopamine satisfaction of online shopping, gaming, or all these other synthesized gratifications. What would the technology out in that room look like, and would it be different if it was heart-led? Ask yourself that question as you reflect on this talk. Because in many senses, it's very exciting to be at an event like this. The future's out there. As William Gibson said, it's just not evenly distributed yet. We get a flavor of the world of tomorrow that is coming and could be coming at scale to a city near you. But at the same time, we're on this knife edge where the collapse is also out there, as Australia, California, Siberia, Greece, Turkey, Portugal, even Spain have caught fire in these increasing heat waves and dry periods that we're having. So my challenge to you is the fact that only the impossible is interesting right now. Only the impossible is interesting. We have to step in to an uncertain and quite difficult, quite bumpy future. And one thing I think is quite clear is that less is probably going to be more. As we try and bring these three climate and ecological crises, the future of work and cities and mobility together in a way that makes sense. And I think that's going to be less commuting, less wasted time, less pointless travel and hypermobility and all of the stress, exhaustion, burnout, and of course carbon and cost that come as part of that, where we're charging around like maniacs the whole time. And we will have more hybrid events such as this, more time, more flexibility, more focus, more productivity, more real human and non-human connection with the world around us, and more, hopefully, investment in the things that really matter. And in some respects, and I might get chased off the stage for saying this at an event like this one, it's like there is a case for dumb cities. There is a case for challenging some of these additional layers of complexity we are attempting to put on our urban environments. There is a case for elegant simplicity, the right side of complexity, which is what nature herself does very, very well. And whether we can find the right low-tech innovations, you may have seen these famous bridges grown from the Indian rubber tree in northeastern India, in Meghalaya, in the cold, wet mountains. And basically, these are trees which are trained to grow into natural bridges. They become stronger as they get older. They don't corrode in the moist atmosphere in the same way a metal bridge would. And I use this as a mental model for you. How do we use our ability to work with our deep wisdom and the grain of nature and not get carried away with our own brilliance of technological innovation? Because ultimately, we're caught on a tightrope between two cliffs right now. We have those who would talk about the projected hope, which is a lot of the techno-optimism of solutionizing, the promise to fix things, the slightly revolutionary messianic fervor, which again we might have heard a bit of out there. And then we have the sort of projected hopelessness, the people who are talking about fatalistic resignation, the misanthropy of the fact that humans aren't very nice things and that we probably deserve everything we get. And where we have to sit as change makers shaping the world of tomorrow is a balancing act between those two projections. And we have to do that with humor and humility and hyper self-reflectivity to keep on asking ourselves those most difficult, awkward, and uncomfortable of questions. And the Japanese have a word for this in a very brilliantly Japanese fashion. It's called Ikigai, and it's called reason for being. And it's a combination of what you love, what you're good at, what you can be paid for, but perhaps most importantly, what the world needs. And when you align those four factors, we will start to address the dissatisfaction that so many of us feel in our work, the problems we are facing in terms of the climate and ecological crisis, and to deploy the right technologies which will solve real problems. And I think one of the reasons that Greta has been so powerful in her challenging of our ways of being is because of her autistic spectrum disorder, which refuses to allow her to look away from the climate and ecological crisis in front of us. And we need to adopt that same approach, to refuse to look away, to not be willfully blind. And if we do that, we have a chance of navigating our way through the climate and ecology crisis, of reinventing the way we do work, and deploying technology appropriately to do so. Thank you very much.
Wow, thanks, Ed. What a comprehensive review of where we are today. I'm sure you've got some questions for him now. You must have. I certainly have. Anybody with questions? Great. There's somebody there right at the microphone. Can't wait. Off you go.
Microphone working, yes. That. Great talk, really enjoyed it. And also your point about the electric cars. I always say, an electric car is still a car. And actually what we should be doing is planting trees where we park all these cars. It takes up too much space that we can use in a much better way. Now, one thing I would like to hear from you is how you take into account population forecasts. Because, in many parts of the world, the population is actually going to decline. Like here in Spain, they think that the population will decline within 50% over the next 50 to 80 years. I mean, that some parts of the world will be growing, Nigeria or whatever, but overall, the natality rates are pretty low. And so we're not replacing ourselves. So my question is the problem of climate change and etc. just solving itself by our population decline? Or are coming these things together and do they make the situation much worse? And how does this also affect work? I mean, because that's also another point in this. I mean, we're talking, we may not have enough people to work because the people that are left over are so old and they can't do anything.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question because it's a systemic question, which is exactly what we should be asking. I mean, in some ways, taking the first part of it, cities are going to continue to grow. I think globally about 1.2 million people a week urbanize and move to cities, and that's going to carry on throughout this century. But then you're right, I think it depends on which parts of the world we talk about. I mean, there are some countries which are still enjoying an exponential population growth, and there are parts of the developed world where often the population is declining. The good and bad news is like that will probably involve mass migration and movement of people. If we don't address the climate crisis, then significant parts of the world are going to become relatively uninhabitable. So perhaps the movement of people created by the climate change that we've generated might actually solve our declining populations, because people will be arriving to replace those jobs and rebuild those populations. And I'm wholly in favor of that type of migration, although I would prefer if it wasn't driven by an existential crisis. But I think it's going to have to pan out something like that. People will move. And also, when you still have this pervasive inequality globally, people will always aspire to something different.
Great, thank you for that, Ed. I do think we're out of time. Can I just get a confirmation from our floor manager that we are out of time for this session? Otherwise, there's a question that I'd like to ask. We have another question anyway, but can I please get some up-to-date timings as to where we are with this session? Please, ask your question of Ed.
Hi, I'm Anna. So the question that I wanted to ask was, when we were talking about big data and big data sets, you mentioned that to store this data, there's a lot of energy being consumed. So the idea initially was that this technology integration is actually making the world a more sustainable place. And but it's working in the completely opposite way. So can you, I'm a little bit confused, to be honest, because that's provided as a solution and the world is really moving into that direction, but it's really not the right direction in terms of climate change. So how do we address this problem, considering that it's moving on at such an exponential rate?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think we're probably going to have to do some deleting. I don't know how many people have got more than about 2,000 emails in their inbox. But I mean, that's the tip of the iceberg. But I think collectively, humanity is going to have to learn how to delete. Because we can't just continue to store ever more burgeoning amounts of data about each other. And obviously that is what is driving the development of this aggregation and agglomeration and analysis. That's not to say we throw the baby out with the bathwater, but the reason I talk about the energy cost of data is the fact we all assume that the virtual world has a little or no footprint. And data aggregation and collection has become so big, so quick, that that's no longer the case. And it's actually going to be a significant chunk of our energy demand, which we also have to decarbonize. So we decarbonize it, we power it with clean energy, but we also become a little bit more sensible and pragmatic about what we store and how long we store it for.
Right, I'm afraid that is time for this session. Can we give a big round of applause then to Ed Gillespie, our keynote speaker? Ed, thank you so much. That was so interesting.